So I'm here with Marie-Claire Beaulieu, assistant professor at the University of Tufts. So this is the heart of the Perseus Digital Classical Library. And I think there are probably two areas of discussion that I'd like to take the opportunity to explore further with you today. And one of those is directly related to Perseus, and actually why there's a whole group of us here this week. And that's this project that's charmingly entitled Perseids. Could you tell us a little bit more about the Perseids project?
Of course. Perseids is very aptly named. It is a constellation of resources. And this is how we conceived of it. In the interest of not reinventing the wheel, we took pieces of software that others had produced, namely the team at the Homer Multitext Project, the team at papyri.info, and several others of our collaborators. And we mashed all of this very happily in one platform, which is now an integrated series of services, which allows for textual editions and annotation. What I think is a very interesting feature of Perseus is the versioning system. It has a very robust...
Right, what do you mean by versioning here?
So it has a very robust interface when you produce an annotation, an edition, or any information. The workflow goes to a vetting group. Right?
Okay.
And so then you send feedback and you can resend to the editor or publish at that point. But we keep all these versions in a repository, and this allows, of course, to track the history of a text. It also allows for collaborative work where somebody can jump in at any point of that process and participate in the scholarship that's being created.
So what's the relationship? I mean, I liked your description of this kind of a constellation of projects. What's the relationship between Perseids and Perseus? Can we just...
Sure. Perseids is nested within Perseus. So we use a lot of the resources that are present in Perseus, not just the text and the image collection, but also a lot of the morphology features. So we used parsing features that come from Alpheus. We use various other tools that are present in Perseus as well, that converge into Perseids to make these publications.
Okay, and who are the we in this case?
Ah, interesting. So the team of Perseids is composed of myself and Bridget Almas.
Okay.
And then we have a whole series of collaborators, namely you at Pelagios. We collaborate very closely with the Homer Multitext and papyri.info. And we have various other collaborations that are emerging now, namely with a team of French scholars who are editing Greek inscriptions in the Louvre, and various other teams around the world who are using Perseids for their own purposes.
Such as, well, when you say for their own purposes, what kinds of things are happening?
Right. Well, for instance, the Louvre team needs an interface that's robust enough to support a scholarly edition, yet pretty enough for the broad public. Right. So they are adapting actually the code for those purposes.
Okay.
So that's the example I have in mind at the moment.
Okay.
But, there's others.
So can we maybe think a little bit about what people can expect from Perseids? What kind of outputs do you envisage here? What kind of outputs do you already have?
That's interesting. So Perseids is designed to create publications. So that's the very basic point, right?
Just to help the editing process.
Precisely.
And we're talking about a digital editing platform here.
Yeah, a collaborative editing workflow. So I am using Perseids to edit a collection of Greek funerary epigrams.
Okay.
So that's one example.
And these epigrams, would they be published in an analog form, in a book somewhere?
They are already published mostly in IG and other such print publications. What I want to achieve with Perseids is to represent accurately the relationship between the monumental support and the text. I am very interested in questions of layout, how the text is organized, and specifically how the meter is represented.
Interesting.
In many cases, there's actually a representation of the metrical scheme. And I want to relate that to, for instance, the Homeric poems or other poems transmitted through the manuscript corpus.
And what can you do in the digital platform that you couldn't do in a book?
Precisely. So we have an interface which was created by the Homer Multitext folks.
And they're at Chicago, right?
They are up in Worcester and in various other locations. And at the Center for Hellenic Study. So the image citation tool that they created allows us to take a region of interest and link that to our edition of the text. So for each word that I edit in my text, I can see exactly where that word is on the stone and what it looks like. So I can justify my editorial choices, right? So in terms of the lettering and so on.
So it's much more transparent. You give the reader, a direct, or the user, direct access to to what you're doing.
And if someone disagrees with my reading, they are absolutely free to add an annotation to this and add multiple layers of text.
So an annotation, because you've used this term before, it's like just giving an additional reference or something.
Precisely.
Okay.
So you could have this be very small and lightweight, such as somebody saying, I read an upsilon instead of whatever letter you put. Or you can have this be a free-form narrative commentary if somebody wants to get down into the details.
Right.
So it's very versatile in that sense, and it supports then a very deep look into that text. So once I have my transcription and my text mapping, I can go into the workings of the language. So we intend to hook Perseids up to the Alpheus tree banking tools, which will allow us to represent both the full morphological analysis of the text as well as the syntactical organization of the text, which shows, in the case of epigrams, it shows the balance that is established within the meter. And so then you can start supporting scholarly claims regarding the style, regarding the balance, regarding the use of the meter, regarding Homeric diction, and various other features of that nature.
That's really interesting. And you mentioned Homeric diction and the Chicago, not Chicago, the Homer multitext.
Yes.
Why did I think Chicago? Anyway, it doesn't matter. So there are also opportunities here, not just for getting a better edition that people can use, and by better I mean enabling people to see you're working out and having that transparent, and really allowing people to have their own input in this. So that's one aspect, but it can also enable interpretation of understanding.
Absolutely, and that's precisely the point. So we want to support interpretation with data and have the two, as you say very nicely, transparently linked together. And so the audience then has all the information they need to critique or to accept the edition. And furthermore, which I think is very important, they have the opportunity to contribute, to change this, to make it dynamic. So it is not the static sort of print where you say, here's what this is. We are proposing things and offering people an opportunity to collaborate.
So I guess I have, I'm really picking up on what you just said there, the opportunity to collaborate. So two questions. First of all, is this platform that you've been developing collaboratively open for anybody to use? And the second question is, you've talked a little bit about the outputs. Can we see them?
Of course.
Okay.
So we are just starting to have a first series of epigrams which were transcribed by my students last semester.
So that's another interesting aspect. So you can involve students in this process as well.
Can use it for hands-on training. Absolutely.
Great. And that can be undergraduate students.
Oh, precisely. At the students who edited these epigrams were in their third semester of Greek.
Right.
So
third semester of Greek. Okay. That's pretty challenging.
It was great. They did a great job. So we expect to have those online very shortly. We're just in the last stages of it.
And that'll be through the Perseus site?
Yes. So we will disseminate them as a collection on Perseus.
Okay.
And they're also available on Perseids for further editing and commenting and so on.
Great. So it's going to be open for everybody.
Absolutely.
And when you say for further editing, so if I'm if I were someone who could do this kind of editing, I could directly edit, or I would go through some kind of editorial board to do the editing.
You would go through the board, so
Okay.
you would say, I disagree with this, or I want to
Yeah.
add something.
Okay.
You would write it up, and this would go to a board that we designate for this, namely me for the moment. But there's opportunities for anyone interested.
Okay, so that's a general advertisement for anybody out there who wants to participate.
Absolutely, we're
in it.
happy to
That's
have
fantastic.
collaborators.
And so, and then going back to the other question I asked, so this is a platform that anybody can use?
Yes.
And if so, how?
We're intending for anyone to be able to use
Mm-hmm.
this, and we're trying to make the interface as user-friendly as possible.
Right.
And some of those features are already going online
But
now.
it would be hosted here,
Yes.
the tabs, and then I had a text and I could upload the text.
Precisely.
I see.
So
Okay.
let's say you snap an inscription somewhere and you want to edit it.
Yeah.
You can put it through Perseids and go through the editorial process.
Fantastic. And if I wanted to do that with my class, could I upload the text but keep it kind of hidden from
Yes.
the general public until we were happy that this is the kind of thing that could be published?
Absolutely. So for classroom purposes, I have used Perseids in that sort of closed
Ah,
manner,
nice.
especially because there was grading involved.
Yeah.
So obviously you want to keep confidentiality.
Yeah, I
So,
see.
yeah.
Okay, that's great.
There's a lot of ways we can do this. We have a community feature which allows several people to create a community together and
Okay.
work within that group,
Mhm.
or you can have it fully open where anyone can contribute.
Fantastic. Now, I wonder if we can have a slight change of gear.
Sure.
And I want to talk about ducks.
Yeah, let's talk about ducks.
In a minute. But
Okay.
first of all, let's take a step back. What you've been working on, in addition to this fantastic digital enterprise,
Mhm.
as far as I understand it, is the idea of the ocean.
Yes.
Look at it as a metaphor in Greek mythology. Can you, and thinking that the question of ducks is going to come shortly,
Sure.
can you tell us a little bit about what your big vision here is regarding the ocean?
Very interesting. So I'm going to say the sea, just to be clear, and
Okay.
make a distinction between the mythological
Sea and
ocean and the
Okay.
sea.
Okay.
But the sea in general is a boundary in Greek mythology. And
Mhm.
furthermore, it is a permeable boundary. I think
Mm.
that's a very important point. And it is the boundary between mortals, immortals, and the dead.
Mhm.
So if you think about this, the sea is this point of transition, so it's physical communication. You can sail on it, right? But in mythological imagination, if you sail very, very, very far away, actually to the horizon,
Yeah.
you end up in the islands of the blessed,
Right.
or in
Right.
Hades.
Right.
And think about this also, if your ship happens to capsize, you sink down,
Yeah.
you end up in Hades
Hades.
just the same.
Yeah.
So there's...
all paths lead to Hades.
Yes. The other thing is that the horizon, which I was just mentioning, is the boundary between sky
Right,
and sea
of
as
course,
well.
yeah.
So there's also an interaction with Olympus here,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
So the sea ends up being that cosmological as well as a physical or geographical boundary. And the two concepts of the sea overlap completely in the Greek imagination. So a physical transition can also be represented as a psychological one.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you think about journeys on the sea, for instance, Perseus is a very good example, right? Perseus flies across the ocean to encounter a divine reality, which is particularly unpleasant in this case, right? Medusa,
Mm-hmm.
and he returns transformed. One of the reasons that he is transformed is because he has passed that cosmological boundary.
I see.
He returns transformed, has passed to the stage of man, as with respect to boy,
Mm-hmm.
which he was before.
Mm-hmm.
So
I see.
we have various other examples of that nature. If you take Ino, which I will return to because she does get transformed into a duck, and that's fascinating. But Ino is mad. She's maddened by Hera for nursing Dionysus. And she dives into the sea out of despair and madness. She is transformed by the experience, and she becomes the goddess Leucothea. Glaucus is maddened by eating a plant of immortality. Mortals cannot sustain immortality. He's already in a very uncomfortable position. He dives into the sea out of madness and comes out as the god Glaucus, who has a hybrid shape from human to divine, right? So he's a half man, half fish. And he has the gift of prophecy, which is typical of the old man of the sea. Actually, Glaucus does get called the old man of the sea. So he becomes one of these age-old divinities, the wisdom that resides beyond the human realm in the sea.
That's fascinating, and I'm glad you mentioned the old man of the sea, because all this time I've been thinking of the Odyssey.
Of course.
Because so much of it takes place on the sea, and you get a real sense of the adventurous spirit of the day, whatever Homer's day is, but really Odysseus pushing the boundaries of where you can go, and as a result, I mean, people have tried to map, of course, the Odyssey's route, Odysseus' route, kind of missing the point that it's kind of meant to be pushing the boundaries, and that it can therefore Odysseus can be like the paradigm for any Greek crossing the oceans. And so each time you come across new and strange peoples, Odysseus is there in the background.
Oh, absolutely.
And people like Irad Malkin have talked about this regarding Greek colonization.
Absolutely.
But just thinking in terms of what you've been discussing, how does that play? Because of course, Odysseus gets offered, the opportunity to become immortal when he's on his island home with Calypso.
Sure.
So, I mean, how do you see the Odyssey tapping into this mythological conceptual apparatus you've been constructing?
Well, I'm glad you're bringing up the Odyssey, because that is obviously a very important example of what I'm saying. The Odyssey is a voyage through the invisible. Right? So Odysseus enters, when he takes to the sea, he enters a world where he is not visible anymore to his family, to the rest of the world, right? He is in his own journey, quite beyond the sphere where normal mortals go. And so he goes to an island of the gods, he goes to Hades, and so on, right? And so his voyage at sea, yes, it is a physical journey, and people, as you say, try to map that journey. But in addition, there's a further layer, which is the cosmological journey, right? And if you notice, Odysseus makes the choice to return, which is why he refuses this immortality. When he does return to Ithaca, he enters the harbor, which is sacred to the old man of the sea, actually. So he enters this harbor, and one of the first things he does is, on the advice of Athena, he hides his treasure in the grotto of the nymphs there. Now that grotto is, first of all, underground, right? And it is a point of contact between mortals and immortals. It has two doors. The Odyssey tells us, a door for mortals and a door for immortals. So it is smack in the middle between different states of existence. Furthermore, Odysseus, at that point, is made invisible by Athena. She puts a cloud around him. And then eventually he decides to disguise himself as a beggar. And finally, eventually, to reveal himself. So in his going away, as well as in his return, we can see that the voyage was a transition between visible or mortal and invisible, namely divine or dead. And the return shows the same, whereby returning through this harbor sacred to the old man of the sea is a transition between invisible and visible again.
That's so interesting. And how is this picked up by later authors?
That's interesting. Actually, the framework that people think with remains remarkably consistent through the centuries. So I have been working on this notion of the visible and the invisible, especially using the image of fog. Fog occurs actually at this boundary between the worlds. Fog is a mix of air and water. And so it's perfectly appropriate to represent that boundary. It's also appropriate to represent what's invisible if it's hidden in fog, right? So actually when Odysseus goes to Hades, we are told that he is in foggy Hades. Other things that are foggy, that grotto of the nymphs on Ithaca is foggy, which makes perfect sense. The grotto of Scylla is foggy. The grotto of Maya, where Hermes is born, is foggy, and Hermes, of course, is the god of that transition.
Right, going in between. Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. Other things that are foggy, Tartarus, Hades, ghosts are made of fog.
Right.
So all of these things...
It's pretty consistent.
It's extremely consistent, actually. So all of these things mark that boundary between the visible and the invisible. And now you ask about how this gets picked up in later centuries. It remains remarkably consistent even through Christian authors. So I have been working on the Navigatio of St. Brendan. And now it's absolutely fabulous. Brendan goes in the North Atlantic with his monks in search of paradise, which very much, of course, reminds us of Odysseus and is also adapted from traditional Irish tales. Now, Brendan sees hell at one point, right? So he comes to the island of the Smiths, who are very hostile and throw molten metal at the monks. And once they are past this island, they eventually get to the island of the paradise, the promised land of the saints. And what happens is that they get stuck in a caligo grandis, and they can't see each other, right? It's extremely thick. And beyond that very thick caligo is the light. And we are told, actually, that there is never darkness on that land, which reminds us, of course, of higher latitudes, but, of course, also the light of what's beyond death. So, as I said, the geographical and the physical overlap completely with the psychological and the cosmological.
Yes, and Hades is a place that's
always dark, of course.
And this is, as well as the Odyssey, and we will get to ducks in a minute, but as well as the Odyssey, I was also minded of, as you were talking, particularly about the crossing the waters and the kind of mist, I was minded of Aristophanes' frogs.
Sure.
Can you maybe tell us a little bit about what's going on? Because that is a kind of a weird whole episode with Dionysus and his slave crossing over to the frog chorus. It's very odd.
It's fascinating is what it is. So, there is a lot of scholarship about, first of all, Dionysus as a world crosser. And I think that makes perfect sense. In the frogs specifically, Dionysus is passing between worlds through water. And the marsh that he goes through and where he encounters the frogs has been linked to the temple and Limnice, right? Dionysus and Limnice, which was important in the Lenaea and the Antisteria. So Aristophanes seems to be alluding to the festival, of course. But further than that, of course, we notice that the way to Hades passes through water. And we know from Hesiod that underground water, and in fact all water, all the rivers are the daughters of the ocean, especially Styx is the first daughter of Oceanus. So very interestingly, we see that all these waters are connected in a very large network. And this network not only covers the surface of the earth, but it actually permeates it and allows for travel in various directions. So you can travel on the surface, you can also travel downwards and upwards back from Hades, right? So we can think about Persephone. She's abducted through the spring Chiane in Sicily. Amphiaros, on the other hand, comes back to the surface through a spring as well. So you can go both directions. So Dionysus in the frogs is accomplishing that journey through water into the underworld. And I would like to add that Dionysus' own personality as uniting the mortal and the immortal is particularly well suited. And I think that that's precisely why the ancients conceive of him in that way, where he is the god who can make that transition because he unites both of the opposites.
He's come back to life.
Precisely.
I see, that's great. So finally, ducks.
Ducks. Let's talk about ducks. So, ducks. The sea is this intermediary space. We just talked about that. animals of the sea in Greek mythology reflect and manifest that intermediary nature of the sea. So animals that we see on the sea in Greek mythology, remarkably, we don't see whales all that much, we don't see octopods all that much, or fish. They don't play a particularly important role. What we do see are monstrous creatures, so we think about the seals in the Odyssey, right, that are stinky and monstrous. We think about iconographical representations where we have hybrid creatures, hippocamps, tritons, etc. We think also about other creatures that are much more benevolent, of course, namely ducks and dolphins. And how do these function? They actually play a very important role in Greek mythology. We see them come back over and over and over, above all other animals, actually. And the reason for this is because they embody this transitional function of the sea. Right. So a duck is a creature that lives on land, dives into the sea, and comes back out in a circular motion. So if we take Ino, for instance, she dives into the sea and becomes this duck. Why a duck? She appears to Odysseus in the form of an Aithria, which is a shearwater. She's often called a Byssa also in one source. Anyway, so why a duck? The duck is a polysemic symbol. So we think about the soul. The soul is winged. We know that from Plato, right? We think about this question of going underwater and coming back out. So
being able to survive underwater.
Precisely. And now the duck is also associated with females in particular. So we see the duck in iconography come up in scenes where they're lovers' gifts. We see them in the women's quarters, sort of sitting there as women are preparing themselves physically with perfume and so on. We also see ducks in funerary scenes as an offering to the dead, and that perhaps connects to their function as a representation for the soul. So when you have somebody who dives into the sea because they are leaving the mortal realm under the impulse of madness for the crime of killing your own children, which is important, the transformation into a duck represents all of these aspects. So it's her soul that is making that transition, as well as her body. In fact, Ovid tells us that she is cleansed of all the mortal elements in her as she hits the sea. So the duck form is her rid of those mortal elements. And we have actually many other myths that follow a similar narrative. So we can think of Aesacus, which is an interesting example. Aesacus is one of the sons of Priam, and he was in love with the nymph Hesperia. Now, there's various versions, but Hesperia dies bitten by a snake, and Aesacus feels responsible because he chased her. He throws himself down the walls of Troy and is transformed. And this is unclear whether he throws himself on land or down a cliff. There's variations in the sources there. But he becomes a duck, a mergus duck, we are told, which is specifically a mergus merganser, which is a duck that feeds itself by diving underwater constantly. Now, we are told by Ovid that Aesacus is not content to have thrown himself down once. He throws himself repeatedly out of guilt, hence the duck shape, and the duck continually dives underwater, and that's this image of lifelong sorrow here for a female lover, of course. So
that's terrific. Thank you so much for taking us on this journey from the new digital world and the kind of potential that it offers for both researchers but also for students and indeed the general public, and now through to a cycle of sorrow that's finishing with ducks continually diving underwater.
But thank you.
That was so interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.